Today, we are talking about revisionist history. Wonderful heroes, Catholic saints, Catholic heroes of history who have been villainized over time, where people have changed the story of who they are. So, really good people who have done great, amazing, even heroic things have been villainized and turned into demons, whether it was through Protestantism, the Enlightenment era, or any other secular history. Today, we're going to be reversing that. So you definitely want to watch this. Catholics, these are the stories we need to know. These are the histories that we need to know. This is our history that people are maligning. So we need to talk about it. In fact, I just read a fantastic book, not my book, but it's called Canceled: 12 Catholic Heroes That History Has Turned into Villains. And it redeems these heroes. It's a must read. It's a must get. Catholics need to know their history. And honestly, Protestants and other people who care about truth also should know their history. And today we're going to be talking with Stephen Weidenkopf, who's been on the show before, and he is a historian and a nationwide lecturer. He's on the radio everywhere. He's written several books on Catholic history, which we've done on this show as well. And today we're talking about his new book, Canceled. It's an ironic book, and it's a great book, Steve. So I want to welcome you to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me back on the show again. I appreciate it.
Yes, and there's many people who have been maligned. Good people like the Templars. You talk about the Spanish Inquisitors who have been demonized. Mary Tudor or Bloody Mary, Guy Fawkes, Columbus, Mary Antoinette, Pope Benedict XVI. I mean, and more. But I mean, Pope Pius XII is one of the biggest ones too. But we're going to talk about some of these today, and we're going to set the record straight for history. Can you talk about, we know that one of the most unenlightened eras in the entire church was the Enlightenment era. And some of the most fantastical conspiracy theories and slander took place during those times. But could you talk a little bit before we get into the Protestant section about how so much conspiracy theories and Protestant slander took place too? I mean, centuries of slander against the church just to make the church look bad. Could we talk about that before we get into some of the specifics?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the Enlightenment period of time, right? You have this rise in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe of various intellectuals who are looking at different aspects of theology and philosophy, and specifically they tended to focus on philosophy. These were a group of educated men, laymen, who again wanted to. They had some issues with the church in terms of her theology. They had a lot of issues with the church in terms of how powerful and important she was in certain areas, in certain countries of Europe. And they wanted to lessen the church's influence in society. They wanted to separate faith from reason. They wanted to separate faith from being, an active component in society. And again, to lessen and weaken the church's economic and societal influence. So how to do that, or one way in which they decided to do that, was they needed to kind of grab control of the academic subjects, grab control of the institutions of higher learning. And the only way in which to really do that was to discredit the church. And one specific attack they look at was the suppression of the Jesuits. The Jesuits during the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe were very powerful in terms of controlling most of the institutions of higher learning, most of the universities and colleges in Europe. And so the way in which these enlightened philosophers and enlightened intellectuals could make sure that their point of view, their secular point of view, their anti-Christian, anti-Catholic point of view could be rooted in society, could take root in society, was to conquer or take over really the universities. And the way in which to do that was they had to get rid of the Jesuits, they had to lessen the church, her influence, and make her look bad, if you will. And so they did that through a multitude of different ways. I focus on how they did that in history and historical subjects because that's my interest in my area of knowledge and expertise. And that's what they did. They went and looked at, previous Catholic historical periods of time and certain historical persons and disparaged them and canceled them and maligned them in order to, for their own benefit and their own agenda in their day and age.
And the Protestants after them?
Yeah, and so what happens with, well, the Protestants would Protestant attack came before the Enlightenment intellectuals. So
So,
you the
and then
Enlightenment
before, yeah.
is fine. Yeah, the Enlightenment intellectuals in the 17th and 18th, the Protestants in the 16th century. And so the Protestant attack that I look at here in the book is, it was from almost the very beginnings of Protestantism in the 16th century through mostly the writings of John Calvin. He was really focused on this, was to discredit the church, the Catholic Church, and somehow through history, and somehow show that she was not the church, that the early church, the Apostolic Church, is not the same as the Catholic Church. And so they looked backwards in time at the church's life and said, they tried to reinterpret writings of the church fathers. They kind of looked at Constantine, who's a figure I address in the book, as someone who that's where the early church, if you will, kind of that's where the Catholic Church comes into being, where the Catholic Church, once it's adopted by the Roman Empire, it becomes Romanized, it breaks from the early church, it breaks from the Apostolic Church, and that's what they would argue, the Protestants, revolutionaries in the 16th century argued that that was the beginnings of the Catholic, so-called Catholic Church, right? And so they use history to try to prove their point, which they need to because people would, argue, and as people still do today, well, there's been one church since Pentecost, if you will. So how do we show, or why do you think that your interpretation of the faith is better than the Catholic Church, which has been around since Apostolic Age? And they do that again through attacking history. But then I also focus in the Protestant attack looking at, from an English perspective, two different figures that are well known in the English speaking world because, again, from our perspective, most of our history over the last 500 years has been presented from an English Protestant perspective. And and so even Catholics, good Catholics, faithful Catholics, they go to school, they go to public education even, or even in some Catholic schools, sadly, the version of history or the perspective of history that's given to them is this heavily, slanted and biased English Protestant perspective.
But I want to fast forward today to modern day. Benedict XVI. Why was he canceled? I mean, he was maligned on. He was a real enigma because he was maligned from both sides. He got hate from both sides, and a lot of people don't seem to know who he was as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I do cover Benedict in the last section of the book on the what I call the so-called Catholic in quotes attack, and that's where Catholics have either adopted or believed these false myths about two of the popes that I cover in that category, Pius XII as well as Benedict XVI, or in some sense they've contributed to the kind of canceled culture around these particular popes because some of these groups are individual or some of these individuals are people who are call themselves Catholic but are not. They want some kind of change in church teaching. Usually it's some kind of moral teaching. Teaching on human sexuality or whatnot, or even with Benedict, for example, we see some people who were angry at him for abdicating the papacy, because that allowed the pontificate of Pope Francis. And so these people had some issues with some of the things in Francis's pontificate. And so they would reason, or they did reason, that, if Benedict hadn't abdicated, then Francis would not have been Pope, which is kind of a silly, argument to begin with. There are, many things that you can look at in various different pontificates, but to blame one Pope for the rise of another Pope is kind of, I think, somewhat specious, and just not a great argument. But during his lifetime, he was an enigma, as you point out, right? Benedict XVI. He was someone who, if you look at some of the accounts of people writing about him in his life, even before he became Pope, it's kind of all over the map. People couldn't really seem to figure this guy out, if you will. He was always presented in some kind of weird contradictory nature. There were some reports and accounts that would show him as this, just kind of nice, happy Bavarian theologian, who's just kind of doing his own little thing and simple and whatnot. And then on the other hand, you'd have reports that called him the, Panzer Cardinal, this grand inquisitor going out and seeking out heterodox theologians and overturning every rock looking for them and whatnot. So he's a very interesting character in modern Catholic history. But Benedict or Cardinal Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, was a man who was born not too far from the Austrian border in the early part of the 20th century, in the late 1920s. He is obviously a young boy when Hitler and the National Socialists come to power in Germany, and he has to, as a teenager, he's living through the Second World War and sees the end of the war and the defeat of Germany, if you will. But through all that, he is focused on his relationship with Christ. He is ordained a priest along with his brother Georg. They're actually ordained on the same day. And from there, he's a brilliant mind. And he goes to university, studies, and becomes a great theologian. Ultimately, then is a professor as well in multiple different German universities and well known. In 1968, he publishes a book called Introduction to Christianity, which is one of his multiple volumes of books he wrote throughout his life. But that was one that really brought him theologically to a lot of attention within the church. Paul VI read that book and really liked it, and that kind of drew his attention to Cardinal Ratzinger, to Joseph Ratzinger, Father Ratzinger at the time. He also attended the Second Vatican Council. He was a theological expert for the Archbishop of Cologne, and helped him during the council. And it was after the council that he created a theological journal called Communio, that to try to help interpret the conciliar documents in an authentic and orthodox way. When there were other theologians that were trying to use the conciliar documents in ways in which they weren't intended and to further their own agenda. But he, if you will, defended the church and defended the conciliar documents. And then eventually in 1981, excuse me, he becomes the prefect for the Congregation on the Doctrine of Faith under John Paul II. And it's there where he kind of this whole notion of this false narrative and myth of Cardinal Ratzinger comes into being, again propagated by many elements of the Western media in the press, other Catholic, so-called Catholic groups that wanted different changes in church's teaching. So they latched on to this false narrative that was presented about him, that he was some kind of grand inquisitor, as I mentioned, and was just not a charitable man, was just looking out to squash all kinds of dissent and all kinds of opposite opinions and whatnot. But that was not who he was. He was a loving man. He was a simple man. He was a brilliant mind and theologian, and a man who operated out of charity in all things, even against theologians who were teaching and writing heterodox opinions in books. He always engaged in dialogue with them and gave them multiple opportunities to recant their teachings, to have a dialogue, to be able to see the error of what they were presenting and teaching and how it wasn't in conformity with the Catholic faith. Gave them multiple opportunities to engage in those discussions. And many of them were able to be reconciled, and many of them weren't, sadly. And then obviously, if you're obstinate in your heterodox opinion as a theologian, then the church has to punish you in a certain sense, right? You have to take away your faculties to teach. If you're not teaching the Catholic faith, you should not be allowed to teach in a Catholic university or a Catholic college or a pontifical university or college. So, he then becomes Pope Benedict XVI, and his, reign was a bit brief, but he did a lot of things during his reign. He wrote three great encyclicals on the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. He helped to expand what he called the celebration of the extraordinary form of the Mass of St. Pius V, as revised throughout the centuries, the so-called Tridentine Mass, if you will. And was this great man who loved the church, so much so that he recognized towards the end of his papacy that he really didn't have the ability anymore physically to meet the demands of the papal office. And so instead of staying in the office and not doing a great job as pope, he decided to abdicate. Right, not the first pope in church history to do so, but the first one since the 15th century to do so. And that caused a lot of consternation in the church as well. But again, to show you how humble this man was, he lived in Rome, right? He remained there. He referred to, he's called Pope Emeritus, but he pledged uncompromising obedience and fidelity to his successor, who was Pope Francis. And so he lived his life in great humility, the rest of his life after he abdicated, in great humility, not seeking out the limelight at all, not trying to draw any kind of, criticism to Francis or anything like that, and just lived his life in his writings and teachings in a humble way until he was welcomed home.
That's the very curious part of it, is that he was this super kind, loving, gentle, and quiet man who just wanted to be left alone, quite frankly. He just wanted to be, if he could, he would have just been in a cave writing books and teaching the world about Jesus Christ through theology. And he even asked Pope John Paul if he could retire. And Pope John Paul's like, nope. He's like, I just want to go write books. Pope John Paul's like, nope. So he tried to get lost a long time ago before he abdicated.
Yep.
But he was a super nice, kind man, yet he was put at the top of the inquisitor's office in a sense. He was put in a sense where he had to keep doctrine intact. He loved Jesus more than himself. He loved the church more than himself. So he made sure to guard the truth with his life. But as you said, he did so in a kind way, a loving way, a gentle manner. And I think that's where people get it wrong, because on one side you have, liberals who say, oh, well, he was a horrible person and he just was angry and he wanted to he was a Rottweiler, we
Yeah.
say it in a good way, they say it in a bad way.
Right.
But then you have the red trads who kind of malign him for the things he's done. Then after Francis came to power, they went looking for things wrong with him and tried to, it's like both sides just kind of coming down on him. And it's like, the whole time I feel like he's just like, just leave me alone. I just want to be. And he was this very holy man. And I respect his humility. I respect his desire just to be with Jesus and to do what's right in all situations, no matter what anyone said. He was even maligned by Muslims, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, right, for the whole Regensburg address, yeah, where
Yeah.
he was misquoted. Went back to the University of Regensburg where he had taught as a professor, and was giving a larger speech on just really the world and the role of faith in the world, and that was kind of the subject, if you will. And then he made a reference to, he directly quoted a quote from a Byzantine emperor, who was talking or writing about Islam. And so he just quoted that. It wasn't even his own words. He was quoting, a historical document written from a, quoting a historical figure. And that was taken out of context. It was used against him. It was, shown, the modern media presented it as this, here's the Pope who's, stoking the fires of the Crusades again or whatever. And sadly, that false narrative that was perpetrated really by the Western media took root in some areas of the Muslim world and actually led to violence. And even, there were Christians who were Catholics who were killed because of it. And so obviously nothing on,
And
it's
death
not
threats for him.
threats for him. Yeah, it's not nothing that he did or anything that he set out to do. Obviously, it was completely twisted. So.
Maybe you could talk about Mary Antoinette. She's a famous case who has been maligned through history. What was her deal?
Yeah, so Marie Antoinette actually is an interesting character, one of the most fascinating characters I mentioned in the book, because she is someone who was maligned, canceled, and scapegoated not only in history, but also during her own life. So during her life, she was presented that way by elements of the French nobility and some of the Parisian press who didn't like her. So who was Marie Antoinette? Well, she was born in Austria, in Vienna. She was known in Austria as Maria Antonia. But when she came to France as a young girl at 16 to marry the crown prince at the time, who was Louis Auguste, who ultimately becomes Louis the 16th. Then when she comes to France, her name is changed from Maria Antonia to Marie Antoinette. And so that's what she's known in history. So she marries Louis when she's a young teenager. He eventually comes to the throne as king when she's 19, 20, and so she's queen. And as a young woman, Marie did live a pretty extravagant lifestyle in the Palace of Versailles. She was very focused on clothes and fashion. She spent a lot of money on clothes. She was well known to enjoy gambling and cards and playing cards and throwing dice and these kinds of things, staging parties and doing all kinds of fun activities in Versailles. And so that early stage of her life was taken on later by these propagandists, especially the Parisian press and elements of the French nobility who didn't like the fact that she was Austrian. One of the reasons why they didn't like the fact that she was Austrian is earlier in the 18th century, France had been at war with Austria. So many of the French nobility at the time had lost parents or friends or relatives, and siblings, if you will, during that war. And so they really didn't have a great love for Austrians. And so they put all of that hatred, if you will, onto her even during her lifetime. So they take these early stories of her life, in her extravagant lifestyle in Versailles when she was younger, and they made that the kind of norm for her throughout her life, which is not true. When she actually became a mother, she and Louis ultimately had 4 children. When she became a mother, she changed radically. So she reduced her focus on gambling. She still loved diamonds, and she still loved to dress nicely, and she still liked her nice dresses and whatnot. But she radically changed her life. And even during the time when she was younger, she was a lifelong Catholic, very devoted to the faith, and actually loved the people of Paris and France as a whole, her adopted country. So some of the things that Marie doesn't get enough credit for is she actually brought to France a pastry which she used to enjoy very much as a young girl in Austria. And the French greatly adopted this pastry, so much so that it's become completely synonymous with France, and it is the croissant. So everybody thinks that croissant is French. In origin, it's not. It was Austrian, but the French have adopted it, and it's become their pastry of choice, if you will, and a good pastry. But it came from her, so she brought that to France. And she also brought a great love for her people. So this whole notion and this quote, and I talk about this and write about in the book, that she supposedly, allegedly said, what during the height of the financial crisis in France at the end of the 18th century, when people are starving and there was no bread, she supposedly famously quipped, we'll let them eat cake, right? And as I point out in the book, she never ever said that quote. That's a complete falsity. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why she's highlighted on the cover. She never said that, and it really bothers me, frankly, that people still believe that today, that she may have uttered that phrase. And the whole purpose of that, obviously, was to try by these propagandists, anti-Catholic, anti-monarchists, during the time of the French Revolution and after it, was to paint the monarchy as aloof, right? As people who didn't care about the sufferings of the poor people. And actually the opposite is true. During that time in France, the late 18th century, during the financial crisis, Marie actually helped pay for soup kitchens to be established in Paris, and helped to provide food for the people. She loved the people of Paris, and she was very much concerned about their suffering. And so this whole quote was never attributed to her actually during her lifetime, not even in the years after the revolution. It occurred much later, that it began to be attributed to her because there was a time in French history where there was movement afoot to try to restore the monarchy, and there were many people in France who wanted the monarchy to be restored later. And so, again, in order to discredit the monarchy, people created this propaganda and story about her and foisted on her. It may have been said, if you kind of look through the history of this quote, it's possibly that it was said by the first wife of King Louis XIV, who was Maria Theresa of Spain, but she died 72 years before Marie Antoinette was even born. So people really need to not think that Marie Antoinette ever said this quote, because she didn't. Sadly, as things got out of hand in the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries attacked both the church and the monarchy, both she and King Louis the 16th were guillotined in 1793.
Yeah, one thing that really strikes me in reading all these is that, Protestants, the Enlightenment era, many of the so-called super enlightened individuals, intellectual individuals, the French Revolution, top nobilities, they have no problem weaponizing slander. They have no problem. In fact, they engage in it in order to take down an entire organization, people, group, and they pass it on. Like the whole beginning of this book, people, it talks about how the Enlightenment era actually weaponized just lie after lie after lie about the Crusades and the Inquisitions and the persecution of this person or that person, and the Catholic Church or the Jesuits just had a bloody history where they wiped out anyone who was in their path. And that spread to so many people, spread to learning institutions who's continued to spread it. down through history. And it's not until recent years that historians are saying, you know what, we've looked into this. We've checked out the secret archives in the Vatican. That's just not the case. But it's amazing the kind of history that people believe. I was a teacher. I've been a Catholic speaker and apologist for 3 decades, but I also worked in public schools, and I've seen the history books just completely bonkers about the Crusades, about the Inquisition, about Bloody Mary, and about half whitewashed or maybe blackwashed history where they take people and they malign them. It's only a one-sided story, and we need to get the rest, which is why I think this book is so important. Um, and also, he has another book called Debunking. I think it's like Catholic History, Debunking 20 centuries of anti-Catholic myths, I believe.
Yeah.
And that's a really good book too, because all of these things need to come to light.
So we have people like Mary Tudor, the great Catholic queen of Europe, or of England rather, who reigned for 5 years in the middle of the 16th century. She's not even known as Mary Tudor. I mean, most people, if you go and ask, if you say the name Mary Tudor to them, they might have no idea who you're talking about. But if you
True.
were to say this name, they'll exactly know. If you call her Bloody Mary, everyone will have heard of Bloody Mary because that's how she's been identified in our Protestant perspective history. And that's a disservice and a calumny against who that woman actually was.
And why is that? Who was she compared to who they make her out to be?
Yeah, so Mary Tudor was a woman who suffered greatly in her life, right? So she's the daughter of Henry VIII, or she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And obviously, we know most people know the history of Henry VIII and the many different wives that he had. Ultimately, he divorces, illegally and illicitly Catherine of Aragon, his given wife, his legitimate valid wife, and instead marries Anne Boleyn first, and then a whole series of other women after that. And takes England into schism, really. He breaks from the church in Rome, has Parliament declare him to be the head of the church in England, and he separates Mary and Catherine, so that Mary, for a good portion of of her life, from during her teenage years, she never saw her mom. She actually was refused, an audiences with her mother. The king would not let her see her mom. Even when Catherine was on her deathbed and dying, Catherine asked the king to be able to see her daughter one more time, and Henry said no. And one of the reasons why Henry did this was he kind of put aside Mary, if you will, because he had a daughter with Anne, and that's Elizabeth, who becomes queen after Mary Tudor. But so he favors her, and she becomes a legitimate heir to the throne. And then later, his son that he has with Jane Seymour, Edward VI, becomes the legitimate heir, and he becomes king. Before Mary becomes queen. But Mary had a really difficult childhood, obviously, because of that. Her parents divorce. There's great animosity. She's put under house arrest. Her husband, or her, I'm sorry, her father is bringing England into schism, or brought England into schism. And then under her half brother, Edward VI, England fully adopts much of the Protestant heresy, and becomes really a Protestant nation. But she maintains her faith. She celebrates Mass in her home, has priests come and celebrate Mass for her in her home. She never wavers. She never adopts the Cranmer, Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican liturgy, if you will. She maintains her Catholic faith, persecuted for it throughout her life. But eventually, in 1555, she's able to come to the throne when her half brother Edward dies. And she makes it her point in her reign, the goal, the singular, almost singular goal of her reign was to restore the Catholic faith in England. And she did. And so it was her and her cousin, Cardinal Reginald Pole, who helped to restore the faith in England. But as a result of that, many people didn't like that. Protestantism had taken root in many areas of English society, especially among the nobility and other areas. Henry had, dissolved the monasteries and taken the land, church land, and given it over to the English nobility. So there were many that were not happy about what Mary was doing. And there were some Protestant believers, especially in London, who were caused problems and who were a threat to her reign. And so they were arrested and were interrogated, if you will, in terms of their faith, were given opportunities to repent and recant and to rejoin the Catholic Church. They refused to do so. And so many of these men and women she had then executed. So she executed them, or at least the royal officials did, not the state. And so, because of that, later on, after her reign, there's a series of books and things that are written about that period of time during Elizabeth's reign, and they illustrate and show that these Protestants who were executed during Mary's reign were somehow, these great martyrs. And so the narrative kind of erupts then, really, or arises that Mary was this bloody tyrant, that all she did was go around and hunt and seek out Protestants and execute them, which is not the case. Most of these cases that were and people who were arrested occurred in London. Many of them also were obviously threats to her reign. They wanted her to be deposed and wanted her half sister Elizabeth, who was Protestant, to come to the throne. And so this was after her death, a lot of narrative, false history that was presented about her. And so she got the moniker Bloody. Really, that didn't come into being until the 19th century. And from then on, it's been kind of a staple of history. Sadly, if you well, interestingly enough, ironically, if you contrast her half sister's reign, Elizabeth, it was Elizabethan policy to eradicate the Catholic Church in England, to specifically hunt, and that was never a policy with Mary. She reinstituted the faith. She restored the faith. That was the faith in England, but it wasn't this, governmental policy to go around and hunt out Protestants wherever they were and hunt them down, unlike what it was in Elizabeth's reign. So during Elizabeth's reign, you have the first state-sponsored persecution of the Catholic Church in Europe since the Roman Empire, where English Catholics and priests who came to England to minister to the underground Catholics in England were specifically hunted down by royal officials and horribly executed. But yet, in our history, because it's presented from an English Protestant perspective, Elizabeth is highlighted and upheld as being this great monarch, the great Virgin Queen of England, although she wasn't. And Mary is somehow this negative, horrible, bloody figure, if you will.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me that nobody did anything to King Henry, and he launched this awful persecution against Catholics. Same thing with Queen Elizabeth. And yet Mary almost seemed to do it, as I understand it, in self-defense, because there was a lot of Protestant violence, there was assassination threats and that sort of thing. It wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to go take out these Protestants for no reason. Like, it was like to protect herself and her life. Like when you talk about, a threat to the throne, we're talking about losing life, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there were plots, during Elizabeth's reign and things like that as well. But many of those were politically motivated. Some were definitely, motivated by Catholic rebels who wanted to, so-called rebels, who wanted to obviously end the persecution of Catholics in England. And so that's the distinction between those two women in their reigns. Absolutely.
Um, so we're talking about canceled 12 Catholic heroes that history has turned into villains. Steve, where can they find this book and where can they find you?
Sure, absolutely. That book is published by Catholic Answers Press. You can see it find on their website, which is shop.catholic.com. Also available, should be at any good Catholic bookstore near you. Also available online at Amazon and other retailers. And more about me, you can find me on my own website, which is just my name, Steve Weidenkopf, all together.com. Or you can go on to, I teach at the Christendom College Graduate School of Theology. You can go on to our website there and find the classes that I teach and a little bit about me on there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And people, I highly recommend you just go buy this book. As soon as you're done with this video, go to Amazon, go to Catholic Answers, Catholic.com. Just go to their shop. It's right there. Go somewhere, buy this book. And I highly recommend it because we need to know history. The world doesn't know history, so we need to know history and we need to educate them. All the people at your family parties, all the people that you're going to be talking to in colleges, wherever they're going to be giving these, historical, fancy revisionist history. So we need to know the truth that'll set us free and set them free. So thank you, Steve, for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Yeah, have a good day.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Please check out our description show notes below. I will link this book and I will link Stephen's information below. And I will link our information below, our 10 platforms, our YouTube channels, and everything else. So thank you all for watching and God bless.